everyone from wherever you're streaming in from, or if you're watching the recording. Today, we are going to talk about managing digital assets at scale. And I'll be drawing on some lessons learned as Kaleido and from our customers and talking a little bit about what's next as well. My name is Steve Cerveny. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Kaleido. This talk was originally presented at Sibos a couple of months ago, and we had some requests from some of our customers to do a replay of that. So that's what we're here to do today. If you have questions, we'll leave some time for Q&A at the end. Please just drop your messages into the chat, and we'll circle back to them as we go. If you're not familiar with Kaleido, we are a blockchain and digital assets company. Our mission is to make those technologies radically simple for enterprises. That's been our day one mission. And in a lot of ways, it's still day one in the space, which makes it a very fun and inspiring place to work. While there's been tremendous progress, that we still have a ways to go. Kaleido as a company, because we focus on enterprises, and this has led us to serve some of the largest companies in the world. As you can see, we are not a sector specific. We're not a fintech company, for example. We really are just a technology company of blockchain and digital assets. And over time, Kaleido is over 5 years old. We have really increased the amount of the technology surface area that our platforms and products help with. Starting with just kind of the core chain infrastructure and growing from there to the off-chain stack, to digital assets tools, into CDBCs, which I'll be talking a little bit about and using as examples through this discussion and beyond. And just real briefly, how we look at our product suite, we think about it in 3 layers. Starting with the chain infrastructure on the bottom. And we see chain infrastructure as a continuum of different configurations, starting with a permissioned private type of chain all the way on the left. And then all the way over on the right is a totally public, permissionless, open chain. And in the middle are kind of hybrid type configurations. So Kaleido provides technology and infrastructure across that whole spectrum. And we do that across different protocols, ecosystems, and communities. So we are very much kind of an agnostic provider of chain infrastructure. That is our bread and butter. But if we go up the stack, you see kind of the middle layer is infrastructure for digital assets. So this is by definition not the chain, it's the off-chain stack. And at the middle of that is a really powerful open source project called Firefly. And Firefly is an orchestration engine. It abstracts away the complexities of connecting with and integrating with a blockchain, as well as other off-chain systems. It itself is a full stack platform that manages transactions. It indexes a state and data for you for your reference later on. It helps with streams of events. It has low-level tools to turn smart contracts into APIs, and it connects with the wallet stack, which you see to the left of that, to custody your key management credentials. And then at the top layer are fit for purpose products and offerings. These sort of really build on top of Firefly and provide a set of enterprise extensions, additional tools that are integrated. So, for example, smart contract management, dealing with the complexities of smart contracts, purpose-built tools for digital assets and NFTs as well. So that's just a quick kind of context if you're less familiar with Kaleido and our products. And for the rest of this talk, I'm going to be sharing some of our perspectives on the broader digital asset space. So first, I think it's important every now and then to take a pause and really just think about where have we made progress over the last 12 months? What are the broader trends? What's accelerating? What's decelerating? What's moving faster? What's kind of maybe slowed down as well? And when I step back and I think about the space, the green arrows are areas that we are seeing really move faster, in some cases move quite a lot faster. So a few of those in the CDBC space, really wholesale CDBCs, we see moving, progressing through that funnel from POCs to pilots into live implementations, just an acceleration through the funnel. Not quite there yet with a lot of live CDBCs, but we're moving from white papers in, beyond POCs into broader scale pilots. Interop is another space where we do quite a lot as a company. I think there's a pretty broad consensus that there will be many chains where stores of value and assets are, and therefore everyone needs an interop strategy. Everyone needs an interop strategy, and so that sort of connectivity into every different chain and ecosystem that you need to connect to, and the ability to do things across those different chains becomes very critical for you to have a functioning strategic digital asset stack. And then the final one that I'll call out is real world asset tokenization. I think for me, especially in the financial services space, with the deceleration kind of in the crypto winter and the regulatory climate, particularly in the US, but other areas of the world, moving at the pace that it moves, that's led to less focus on crypto custody. Again, that's a somewhat of a regional perspective because there are areas where that's moving fast. But I think to overgeneralize, if crypto custody was kind of the first use case under consideration, real world asset tokenization is the second one, I would say, for broadly in the financial services space. And what we're seeing is a huge acceleration in asset tokenization. And when you think about digital assets beyond crypto, where crypto are really, if you think about it, very simple assets, and a crypto transfer or trade, to from amount, very simple. Contrasting that with real world assets where you can have an arbitrary amount of complexity. This could be very complex financial instruments with different conditions and triggers for states to move. They could have very long maturity cycles. Could just an order of magnitude or even more sort of complexity in the digital asset lifecycle. And that means when you think about tokenizing those things and managing them throughout their life cycle, the tool set and the technology platform that you need is much more sophisticated and robust than for much simpler kind of crypto type use cases. So lots of progress there, but the consideration for your digital asset strategy has an even broader mix of factors kind of coming into it. Of course, as a technologist, technology is certainly one pillar of that, but it's important to recognize that it's not the only pillar. That regulatory concerns, risk management are always factors in the financial services space. Really focusing on the business value and your customer needs, putting that front and center. One thing that we saw in the early days of the blockchain space with everyone trying to just get their arms around the technology was there were a lot of proof of concepts just for the sake of understanding the technology. I think we've largely moved out of that space. And the sort of projects that we work on today are quite focused on end business value. One thing that we see quite commonly with digital assets is there is something of a network effect, meaning, if you put an asset on chain, but you don't have a way to interact with cash or with value, it's really hard for that asset to move through its life cycle. So you sort of have these dependencies on different aspects of the broader digital asset space maturing. And as all of those things are moving along at their own space, what you could say is logically, it's harder to get things done end to end on the front end. But as different pieces come online, different enabling pieces come online to broader workflows, then I think it's logical to expect the huge acceleration on the back end as more of those pieces just become available, ingrained, accessible as a developer, programmable into your tech stacks, and sort of at your fingertips. And we're starting to see that as well. But when we think about scaling in particular, and the what are some limiting factors or headwinds that you're seeing to that? If I were to give just some rough approximations, what we typically see when talking with our customers across the financial services space is there's a whole bunch of use cases identified, right? Just a number of use cases. And it's quite common now for us to see 50 to 100 person teams that are part of the digital asset team. So really significant investments that are being made, really across the industry. And that's an average. I've seen up to 500 person teams as well. But with those investments, kind of where we're at is, still a relatively small number of use cases that are completed, or maybe they are completed, but they're, as I was describing a minute ago, waiting on other pieces of the puzzle to come online to really unlock the next level of business value, unlock the next level of scale. And when we talk with our customers about their digital asset strategy, I think scaling and interop are probably the top two items, although potentially privacy is up there. So let's call those the top three considerations of things that the folks are really trying to map out. Another theme that we've seen is, especially for early movers in the space, we've seen banks who have done a number of POCs with different business units over a number of years now. And one thing that I think is really interesting is we're seeing companies take a step back and kind of reshuffle the teams, marshal the resources, and think more holistically about a strategy. And so that's why we really wanted to talk about that broader strategy, because many of you are already thinking along those lines of saying, okay, if I really want the next iteration of our digital asset strategy is going to be a platform that needs to exist, many years into the future. And so it becomes a much more strategic phase of the overall projects that you're working on. Quite often you've seen, for different teams, especially if they're in different lines of business, they went and they made 25 tactical decisions, right? To get the project done. In retrospect, some of them sort of feel a little random, right? And now, especially when you compare that across 2 or 3 projects, all of a sudden, oh, that was built on Ethereum. Well, that one was on Fabric. That one was on Corda, etc. Oh, this one, here's the wallet technology. That one we sort of just rolled our own. And when you're taking a step back, now what we see with a 10-year time horizon is a much bigger emphasis on, okay, how can we have flexibility and pluggability? What is like a unified stack? How does that work from a business process perspective? Who has authority in our large organization to make these sorts of decisions? Some companies have carved out a digital asset team. Sometimes it's more flowing with the lines of business, and there needs to be coordination and centers of excellence and sort of models along those lines. But scaling, interop, and scaling could be multiple dimensions, by the way. This could be, transaction volumes and sort of the reality of where blockchain-based systems are today versus how your traditional legacy systems, run, sort of the mismatch of those and how you bridge that relative difference. But scaling could be on other dimensions as well. It could be, hey, if we realize that we're going to need to connect into dozens of different chains. Some of them may be CDBC chains that are setting up, so cash networks fundamentally. Some of those may be permissionless chains where we expect certain things to happen. Could be stablecoin infrastructure connected with that. Some of these chains could be consortium style chains within the industry, so-called RLNs or regulated liability networks as a pattern. Some of them, could be other sorts of asset networks. So across all of that, you need to scale with the amount of connectivity. And then the intelligence layer on top of that to track all of that state and the interoperability that's needed. So you see how these topics are kind of connected, and it all comes back to the root of that single digital asset strategy and mapping something that's going to give you enough to solve the problems of today, but also give you enough flexibility to evolve and adapt to where things go tomorrow. At a high level, we really believe that digital assets are going to transform thousands of use cases. We are probably still thinking too small about the space, and we do that because it just becomes a proverbial boiling the ocean. We have to start somewhere. And what we've seen roughly, if we look at the blockchain Web3 space as a whole, is there was sort of a first wave that was very crypto-centric, the sort of infrastructure, exchanges, wallets, layer ones. There was a second wave several years ago now. DeFi was very new and interesting. I do think, even though some of those companies are not still around, some of the models and innovations will inform and feed into the next wave, the next iteration. Other sorts of infrastructure came along, things like stable coins, different kinds of bridgings. You started to see layer twos really step into prominence along that timeline. And then, but really thinking about the next wave, where we get to real world assets, where we get to digital assets, well, central bank digital currencies, and really mainstream financial services adoption. That's where the aperture really, really opens up. And it's about, transactions, but it's also about engagement, how different owners interact with their assets, how that can unlock, many, many new business opportunities as those life cycles of those assets gets digitized. And the new experiences that can come with that are quite powerful. We need a corresponding third wave when it comes to infrastructure. We see a rise in new platforms, new gateways. I think digital identity plays a significant role. Again, back to my model of kind of broader network effects or meta network effects across all of this. I mentioned different pieces of the puzzle. Digital identity is a huge piece of the puzzle that's rapidly maturing and coming of age. And then our chain infrastructure also really needs to rise to meet the challenge of these thousands of use cases, and we need to think about mass scale. Okay, so let's transition a little bit and step into a notional example. I actually took this diagram from a white paper of a CDBC project, but I'm going to use it more as a kind of a meta example and zoom in on the technology side of things and observe some patterns in how we're thinking about this. But just to introduce the diagram briefly, sort of on the bottom half of it, there is a lot of existing infrastructure that needs to be connected to, and then different sorts of DLT platforms that will enable a central bank digital currency to come online. And then up on the top half of the diagram, you have external parties, so banks connecting into a wholesale cash networks, and at the very top, retail or non-wholesale cash network. So fairly high level diagram here. But I think the pattern that we see, and this holds true much more broadly than just central bank digital currencies in the digital asset space, is kind of a three-tier architecture. A three-tier architecture where you have the digital asset, the DLT or the blockchain layer itself, kind of as the core transaction record system. But then on top of that, you have a middleware layer that is, I think quite a fat layer. Many components are in this off-chain sort of layer. And then sitting on top of that is the application layer and a whole set of APIs for integration into existing systems. And the application layer, of course, is where the business value is ultimately recognized. It's what the user experiences that people interact with. And so this three-tier architecture, we're going to step through this and think about each of these layers and make some observations along the way that we see as being very relevant to your digital asset architecture. So first, the DLT layer. Some of the considerations at this layer. One is the trade-offs with how centralized or decentralized the blockchain itself is. I'm convinced there's no one right answer. I think in a multi-chain world, we'll start to see things that are a little more fit for purpose for the particular use case. The Ethereum blockchain is probably going to be a pretty general purpose blockchain, and it's evolving, how its structure to really cater to that. However, we also could observe a central bank digital currency chain that may not need to make some of the same set of decisions if, especially if it's not intended for assets to sit on that chain and for it to only be a store of digital currency, right, of value. You could really optimize the chain for that purpose. You could think about, consensus and permissioning and, the rules of engagement. You could tune quite a number of things across that environment to make it fit for purpose. DLT versus blockchain is another sort of theme, or there's a realization that at this point there are a lot of different ledger technologies out there. Some of them aren't even strictly blockchains, and as we talk building upon the example of kind of fit for purpose or specialized networks. I was just having a conversation yesterday with a large central bank. And we sort of spent some time on the topic of does it need to be a blockchain? And what is the difference between a blockchain and a DLT? So this is something that is still very relevant, and it's at the base of the stack, and tied to that is the privacy model. You kind of have this right now. You have this fundamental choice of, do you want to sort of have these tokens or these digital assets, largely managed off-chain with proofs of their existence, or some trusted party like a notary, who you can ask questions to and you can trust the answer, and there's one copy of that. There's one set of a coordinated ledger, or something more quite different, an Ethereum style model that's not UTXO based, but it's very much hey, there are tokens, and you sort of embrace the fact that that's on chain. And so you get into concerns with, well, that means that parties can see other parties' balances. And so the privacy model is a very relevant major concern. We are seeing innovation in the EVM space, looking at, for example, zero knowledge proofs, and how those could be used to provide what is called shielded tokens, to have just enough disclosure to just the right parties. That's a space that's evolving. There are other, that's just one example. There are other examples, but the privacy model really is top of mind, and key to mass scale of digital assets. Because I think a lot of people feel like they need to make a set of trade-offs today that are not quite, a little bit suboptimal, or not quite where they'd like them to be. Okay, and there are other factors in the DLT layer that maybe I'll touch on a little bit later, come back to. Here's a blown up view. Scalability. That this continues to be top of mind, in particular in the financial services space. Optimizing for throughput and latency. Right now, we have a number of customers that are running benchmarks, that are assessing the use cases that they can roll with today, and some of them that maybe they need to just wait a little bit on, and so the processing scalability and the finality characteristics are relevant DLT layer considerations. One thing that is a huge area of importance for a mass scale digital asset architecture is the actual topology of that. And some of our customers are themselves actually designing one of these, a special chain to serve a specific purpose. And there the topology becomes very relevant. And it's tied to decentralization, which I was talking about a minute ago. How are you how are you going to distribute nodes? Let's say you do want something that's fairly decentralized. In the financial services space, in past eras, purpose-built networks were laid down with dedicated, fiber connections between banks' data centers and Swift and other examples as well. Just domestic networks for high-speed data transfer. The topology matters. Does this all go on a public cloud and is running on their backbone? And if so, what does that mean for the broader decentralization? How do things like redundancy and resiliency work? And how is all of this tied to governance? So who can deploy digital assets? How is that governed or permissioned onto the chain? What does that mean for users of that chain? Can they trust the assets that are on the chain, or should they be much more skeptical and defensive? What is the overall design for that, right? So that's an example of some of the DLT layer considerations that we see as being very relevant. I'll touch for a minute on some trends that we're seeing in the DLT layer. One I've already teed up, which is this idea of purpose-built chains. An example of this with someone we're working with that's public is Swift's phase 2 of their CDBC sandbox and their CDBC experiments is quite large. Maybe over 35 large banks and central banks are all participating in one way or other. So it's quite a large infrastructure footprint. But one of the key things that's different about this phase compared to last round of experiment is we now have in this project fit for purpose networks. So you have networks that are only dealing with cash, and so they're each cash network is its own CDBC, so its own sort of sovereign jurisdiction. And so there are multiple of those that are set up, but there also are asset networks, and those two networks need to interoperate and need to connect with each other. So given the cash and the values on one chain, but the assets on a different chain, you can see how critically important interop is for the life cycle of those assets. Another example of fit for purpose chain in the central bank digital currency space is exploring separate networks for wholesale CDBCs as for retail CDBCs, something that citizens are going to interact with from their mobile phone as a very different set of use cases and requirements than domestic bank networks that are providing access into their back office, right? So thinking about the chains themselves as being fit for purpose. And of course, the other area where there's lots of innovation is with the layering of chains. We first saw this obviously in the public blockchain space, with Ethereum and the rise of layer 2s. We've had webinars here talking about layer 3s and hybrid networks in the public blockchain space. So we have Kaleido has partnerships, for example, with Polygon and their CDK, used to be called SuperNets. We also have partnership with Avalanche and their subnet technology as sort of another layer of scaling that's not even drawn on here, but sort of like a layer 3 dedicated chain. And this concept of layering is actually permeating through into much more broadly than the public chains themselves. And we're seeing this in consortium style projects. We are seeing this in central bank digital currency projects looking at, hey, what if we created in our sort of purpose-built chain layering within that chain? Does that give us additional scalability? Does that give us additional privacy and isolation for different kinds of workloads? So this is another area to keep an eye on. I'm going to skip forward a little bit just for the sake of time and move into the second layer, the middleware layer. And here I think is where, for our customers, we see a lot of companies spending more time than they anticipated, trying to get to good enough and get beyond good enough into something that looks a lot more strategic and scalable for them. I really feel like there's, just so many components to a fleshed out digital asset platform that many of you are thinking about building or in the process of building. And that, stay tuned for another webinar coming soon from Kaleido. I think we to even try to do it justice, we'd spend the whole hour talking through those components and how they work together and what our view on that is. But for this talk, I'll just kind of summarize a few higher level thoughts. One, let's start with transaction management. Fundamentally, this layer helps you connect through to the DLT layer, which is the source of ultimate source of truth. Therefore, you need really reliable and programmable transaction management. Do you want this particular transaction to move really fast? Are you willing to pay a higher gas fee for that to happen? Or are you not as concerned about it, right? So you need a policy-driven approach to transaction management, but you need very, very reliable transaction management. So if you have 100,000 transactions that flow through, let's say they're mint operations, right, for different digital assets, are there exactly 100,000 digital assets on chain? Getting to that level of reliability in your middleware stack, I think, is necessary to get to a much sort of mass scale architecture. Going along with the orchestration engine that sort of manages policies and transactions through their life cycle, and event bus. So transactions, think about those as flowing onto the DLT layer. What comes off as digital assets move through their life cycle on chain are events. So these smart contracts, the digital assets, they emit events off. And those events also need to be reliably consumed and delivered up to the application layer into existing systems. They need to be indexed and tracked for business intelligence layers and so forth. So having a real-time event bus that is scalable, that can keep up the scope of your digital asset platform, is also really important. And if you think about, we mentioned on a scale of dozens of chains, this event bus needs to be listening for relevant events, filtering out quite a few that are not relevant to you, but identifying important events that you care about and serving those up. So if you take a chain like Polygon that has billions of NFTs on it, that are digital assets fundamentally, there's a small subset of those that you're ever going to care about. But for those, you really do care about them. So you need all of the information, and you need a rich indexing layer that's tracking all of that state. Let's talk about custody for a minute. Of course, key management is something that many folks are quite familiar with, and perhaps in large part because you remember when we talked about the 3 waves of development. Wallet infrastructure really dates back to the beginning of crypto. You can't hold crypto without a wallet. And so we are familiar with that as a part of the technology stack. But what's happened over time is there's quite sophistication that's been developed and really pioneered, a whole new category of key management. We're all comfortable with storing our keys into hardware security modules, or HSMs. That's how we store keys for many things as enterprises today. MPC wallets as a whole new, a totally different sort of technology and security layer. The ability to break the key in half and to create policies and workflows on top of those is a really promising area of space. But that requires you, getting skills and understanding these technologies, bringing them in-house, getting them approved and through risk. And so and compliance. There's a whole sort of institutional side to that. And then sort of more broadly from the wallet technology itself for blockchain type storage, how does digital identity then interact with that? We are not really at a place as a community where we have a single wallet that sort of spans digital assets, crypto, and digital identity. But there's focus on that. There's the Open Wallet Foundation within the Linux Foundation is working on that. And Kaleido and many other companies are very interested and eager to see that sort of all come together. Interop is a theme that's come up multiple times in this presentation. We see a lot of enterprises really favoring what you'd call a trusted bridge style for bridging. If you think about two high level, two styles of bridging, one that's decentralized and purely on chain, or as on chain as possible. These are bridges that have been deployed in the crypto world that unfortunately have quite a large attack surface. And when you read in the news about crypto exploits, quite often it's really a bridge, a decentralized bridge that's out there that is the thing that's getting hacked. There is a very different design that you could choose to make for that bridge, where a trusted party off chain is orchestrating what's happening on chain. That sort of trusted bridge style is we see as quite often preferred by enterprises for a number of reasons. Security, but there are issues of governance and ownership and so forth that we actually see that as being quite preferred. To effectively build a trusted bridge, though, that really does sit squarely in this middleware layer. The end-to-end orchestration of that, you'll need access to custodial wallet infrastructure. You need really reliable connectivity into both chains. You need the event bus for triggering when different things happen as things, for example, asset moves into an escrow contract on one side and cash moves into an escrow contract on another side. There's lots of events, and there's this mini state machine and workflow that needs to be stepped through. So we see our customers really working through and building out those workflows, and they are absolutely a part of this middleware layer. And so I introduced many of these topics already. Maybe one that I didn't go into yet is data management. Remember I was describing there's all this data out there that's happening on chain, and then there's a subset that's really critical for your business. And that data needs to be parsed, understood. The industry term is indexed, needs to be stored in a database where it can expose rich queries so that you can write sophisticated queries on it. It needs to be integratable with, maybe through ELT processes, for example. You need to be able to move that data into your other data platforms that you have, maybe for AI or analytics use cases. So if you want to detect anomalies and things that are happening for your digital assets, having a fire hose where this index data can then be promulgated through to a data lake or other storage areas within your IT data estate, that becomes a very important piece as well. But just understanding the digital assets and the indexing itself. Remember, I described how moving from crypto to real world assets is really 1 to 2 order of magnitudes more complexity in the assets themselves. So the indexing is really the area where you see that take hold, because that asset could have a really long running life cycle. It could have many states, it could have many participants involved in it. Just being able to understand that, to visualize that, and to track it accurately, that falls squarely into a data management layer where we see lots of focus, lots of innovation on these strategic digital asset platforms that are being built out. A couple trends that I'll call out quickly on this middleware layer. One is there are some open source pieces of software that you can drop into the stack that will solve and check multiple boxes at once. So it's not just about solving each of these problems in isolation. How the orchestration engine interacts with the wallet layer, and how it interacts with the policy engine, and how the connector framework layer serves up the orchestration engine and the data layer. Like, all these pieces really need to be connected together. So we're seeing more holistic sort of platforms evolve, and some of them are open source. I mean, this is just good strategy for you, right? You really should take a close look at what's open source out there, because there you have whole communities of people and you have a framework that's designed. I'm showing Firefly here, very promising project. And Firefly, not only does it have implementations for many of these pieces, it has a framework for how they could fit together. And it's designed to be very unopinionated and pluggable, which are really foundational, checks on the checklist for a strategic digital asset platform. So it becomes a no-brainer to really, jump in, with the wisdom of the herd of many people throughout the community that are enhancing, expanding this sort of platform, and you sort of jump into the current, and you get to enjoy the benefits of lots of innovation that are coming from all quarters. Then sort of corresponding with that is just this idea of a whole enterprise architecture, getting out of just tactical mode of trying to solve each of these problems as a one-off for a specific project, thinking more holistically, more strategically about an enterprise-wide architecture. It's definitely something that we're seeing a lot of. If that's not happening inside of your company today, you probably should be asking yourself why, right? Why, and start to sort of think and broaden your thinking on this way. I teed up a couple specific examples, and we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to just touch on them briefly, and then we'll have a brief Q&A and send you on your way. I mentioned the Swift project, and how I think this is really relevant because it cuts across multiple topics in a single illustration. It's a very efficient, thinking about digital islands, right? These different chains, how, for good reasons, we're going to have multiple chains fit for purpose, but that then creates an interoperability problem. We don't want to repeat sort of the hyper siloed world that we're in today. So putting the right amount of focus on interoperability, and on how these different digital islands can connect together. Another example that there's a paper that was published through the Australian Central Bank at their digital currency pilot, and DFCRC, the institution that was really driving that project. Here we see how this is a great example of how central bank digital currency projects themselves are really moving forward quickly, moving into these like industry-wide POCs. So ecosystem-wide pilots. I think that's my one phrase summary of where a lot of these projects have gone from very point POCs in just a number of months. There are many participants that were running on this network. They're testing a variety of different use cases. It was all happening sort of in parallel. You have these regulatory sort of sandboxes that are being opened up to the whole community. So tons of innovation that is happening here. And as Kaleido, it's sort of our privilege to be working on a number of these around the world, really taking a lot of those learnings and cross-pollinating them, across different areas in the digital asset space. This one I think is really worth calling out because so many people are watching Brazil, a top 10 global economy, a very advanced financial sector, and looking at trying to get into production by the end of next year, and really focusing on, for EVM and Hyperledger Besu, a base for the DLT layer, how to have the right level of privacy in a wholesale CDBC network. So lots of interesting things happen there. Another example of is within the US, the domestic payments network, the ACH network, which is very established. Over $60 trillion flow through it every year. If you live in the US and you don't get a paycheck in the mail, you get something delivered to your bank account it's flowing over this network, as an example. There are many use cases that could benefit from decentralization, and a need to improve efficiency, but certainly thinking about the sort of scale of some of these networks, many relevant considerations. A final example from Asia. This is again another publicly referenced network that we've talked about before. I think it's cool to see how these things evolve in production over time. So year 4 in production, starting out with a domestic remittance use case, expanding into stable coins and more broadly payments networks. Just really great to see how you can start with a single use case, get focused, get into production. But from there, once you have a network, if you've designed for a certain amount of repeatability and scalability, then expanding the number of use cases, leveraging the fact that there are multiple participants already connected in, and growing that network over time. Okay, so I'm gonna pause here with the webinar and check the chat if there are any questions. We can transition to that, and I just say, hey, if you're not connected with us, Kaleido, if you want to, there are multiple ways on the screen to get in touch. So I'm going to flip over to the questions panel now, and go ahead, and if you have one, go ahead and type it in. But the first one I see here has to do with a zero trust model for security within this architecture. Zero trust is very, very relevant, and then sort of which AI models are you using for the security. I think it's important to remember, what's different about blockchain. It's this sort of fundamentally multi-party sort of a system. The reason why you're interacting with the blockchain is because someone else is also interacting with that blockchain. So, I know people use the parallel of kind of like the internet itself. You can love it or hate it, right? But the fact is that blockchain as a networking technology is a little bit different. Now, we talked about a three-tier architecture. So where I think zero trust is very relevant. So at the DLT layer, it's sort of interesting because it's this network thing that needs, cross connectivity with many other places. But what we see on the step towards a zero trust model is breaking up into layers. So we talked about this three-tier architecture. Now, the middleware and the application layer really are things that companies are thinking about as living inside of their four walls. And they're, applying zero trust principles to that architecture, really, and you can start to treat these systems the same way that you're treating other systems and apply the same methodologies around zero trust and the same sort of thought process and matrix around that. The same way that you're doing that with others. I think to the point around AI models and security, that I think that's a really sort of a fascinating area that my prediction is we're going to see quite a lot of interest and evolution over the next couple of years. But as assets move on chain, and as we talked about, their life cycle is tracked off chain, within your four walls, then running sort of AI models, training models on those, I think is going to become a huge area. So let's crawl, walk, and run. I think the pragmatic steps that you can take today to position yourself quite well is to get that holistic digital asset architecture right. And, for the data layers that exist there, then to think about how that integrates with the broader data platform, and how that can then be fed into AI models and driven into AI models. The next question that dropped in is around platform governance, ecosystem models that I reference. Is it seen as a shared service for all of these banks, for example? I think that's a great question. We're actually seeing we're not seeing convergence on any one single governance approach. We're seeing different models experimented with. In some cases, there is, what we call sort of like a special role, the network operator. And the network operator is taking upon itself, the duty of performing many of the governance type operations. We're seeing, so that's one model. Another model is more of an alliance structure where there is no single entity, and those alliance structure is going to move a bit slower, but it is moving forward, by consensus, right? So there are trade-offs there, and things like DAOs, we see being experimented with in the space to try to facilitate those sorts of governance operations. And we're also seeing just kind of a more of an open approach as well, to governance, where maybe different people aren't trying to solve the governance problem at all, but they're just sort of focusing on use case and sort of the point solutions. So I think the in the governance space, of course, these are quite sticky problems, and they're quite contextual for the industry, for the network, for the specific use cases. And my thought is we'll continue to see a variety of approaches being experimented with and worked on going forward. To the last part of the question around is it really a shared service? It does sort of depend on the model. I think that the other thing to keep in mind is you can transition, sort of from one model to another. So, for example, you can start with a more centralized governance approach with a goal of sort of decentralizing that over time. So someone takes the burden on and provides that as a service, but over time, maybe the goal is to get to where, it's more of a shared service or something like that. Okay, we'll take just one more question and then we'll wrap up. I see a question about how we think arts, antiques, fine arts, how that fits within the real world asset tokenization ecosystem, and what are some kind of important considerations. So absolutely, there is a place in the broader RWA world for real world assets, and for high value assets that could be collectibles, it could be fine art, antiquities, etc. We've seen these use cases for a number of years, so they aren't new. We saw them really burst onto the scene in that wave 2 of my picture earlier, where things like NFTs burst onto the scene. And what we've seen from then moving forward is an evolution towards much a higher degree of sophistication with the sort of platforms that are out within the real world asset tokenization ecosystem. I think because there are so many projects focusing on this, you do have choices about, as you think about building out a platform. Happy to connect with you offline, by the way, to have a more comprehensive sort of discussion on this. But I think short form, couple considerations. One is to think about the getting the right tools in place to really model the life cycle of the asset. You don't want to go too simplistic on that and sort of back yourself into a corner with these RWAs that are on chain, where folks feel like they're just, it's not realistic enough. I think the tooling around smart contracts has become more sophisticated to where you can build a more comprehensive digital asset out of the gate. Keep in mind, what are the unique value adds? Who are the users that you're doing this for? Is it a fractionalization thing? Is it a ease of ownership transfer? Is it an authenticity thing? And sort of what are those value levers that you want to make sure, and then make sure those things get in set. And then the final thought I would throw in is, is there a cash leg to this? Is that something that you're bringing in? Because a lot of, more broadly, even just with, private equities, private assets, we see this like, hey, we tokenize it, but then what? Where's the market? Where's the liquidity? Where are the, how are those ecosystem players coming online? Remember how I talked about more like at a macro view, we sort of have this network effect where different pieces of the puzzle are moving at their own speed. So is there a cash leg? Is there a stable coin that you want to work with to facilitate transactions, right? And if so, then that's definitely a consideration that you want to think about early on in the project, and the different entities and how they can interact with that cash leg. Or is that something that's a future phase and you're focusing on other things? Okay, so with that, thank you for all the questions, by the way. If there are ones we didn't get to quite today, we are please follow up. We dropped in emails in the chat. You can ping us directly there. We'll get to them again. Thank you for coming out. We hope to see you again on upcoming webinars. If there are topics you want to see from us, please let us know. Happy to come back and go deeper on some of these topics. I teed up one of them around that off-chain tokenization architecture. So expect more to come there. You'll be hearing from us more on central bank digital currencies and other topics as well going forward. So thank you all, and look forward to seeing you again soon.